The clink of champagne flutes was a sound Elara had only ever heard in movies. Here, in the cavernous ballroom, atop Stirling Tower, it was a symphony of wealth she was never meant to witness. Hidden behind a thick velvet curtain, the 10-year-old clutched the frayed edge of the photo in her pocket, its other half a ghost she'd chased her entire life. On the stage, the man himself, Alistair Stirling, a figure carved from ice and money, delivered a speech. His voice was a low hum, lost on Elara until the giant screen behind him flickered. A technical glitch. Instead of a corporate logo, a private photo bloomed into view. A smiling young woman with eyes the color of summer sky, her hand lovingly cradling a baby's. On that hand was a silver ring, a twisted vine of ivy. Elara's breath hitched. It was the ring. She knew that hand. Before the guards could even spot her, a child's cry, raw and desperate, pierced the polite applause. "That's my mother!" The words were a fragile missile launched into a fortress of indifference. For a second, the universe seemed to hold its breath. The murmur of the crowd died, replaced by a ripple of turning heads, 1,000 pairs of eyes searching for the source of the disruption. Elara stumbled out from behind the curtain, her small frame swallowed by the grandeur of the room. Her worn-out sneakers, a size too big and stuffed with newspaper at the toes, were silent on the plush crimson carpet. The spotlight operator, momentarily confused, swung the beam around, and for a terrifying, blinding moment, it caught her. A small girl in a faded gray dress, her face smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, her dark hair a tangled mess. She was an anomaly, a glitch in their perfect, polished world. On the stage, Alistair Stirling froze, his speech dying on his lips. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, narrowed on the child. The photo on the screen behind him vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the sterile blue and white of the Stirling Corp logo. But the image was seared into the minds of everyone present, and most of all, into Elara's. Two men in crisp black suits, earpieces glinting, began to move towards her with a swift, predatory grace. Panic flared in Elara's chest, cold and sharp. She had to get to him. She had to show him. Her small hand dove into her pocket, fumbling for the creased, softened square of photographic paper she had guarded for 10 years. It was her only proof, her only link, her gospel. The guards were closing in. "Wait!" she cried out, her voice trembling but full of a strange, unyielding strength. "I have the other half." She held up the pathetic, torn fragment. It showed a tiny, wrinkled baby's hand, her own, clutching a single finger of a woman's hand. The same hand. The same silver ivy ring. From her vantage point, the fragment was tiny, meaningless to the crowd, but to the man on the stage, it was a lightning strike. Alistair Stirling's composure, so famously unshakable, finally cracked. A flicker of something unreadable, disbelief, pain, a ghost of a memory, crossed his face before the mask of cold indifference slammed back into place. The guards reached her. One placed a firm, heavy hand on her shoulder. The touch wasn't brutal, but it was unyielding, an anchor pulling her back down to the reality of her situation. She was an intruder, a nuisance. "Come with us, miss," one of them said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. They began to lead her away, a small defeated ship being towed from a grand harbor. The crowd began to buzz, whispers turning into a low roar of gossip and speculation. Elara risked one last look back at the stage. Alistair Stirling hadn't moved. He was just a silhouette against the bright corporate logo, but she could feel his eyes on her, a piercing gaze that seemed to see right through her skin and into the hollow space where a family was supposed to be. As they guided her through a service door and into the cold, sterile hallway behind the ballroom, the sound of the party faded, replaced by the hum of ventilation and the squeak of their polished shoes on the linoleum. The dream was over. The warmth, the light, the hope. It was all behind the door. And yet, for the first time in her life, the ghost of the other half of her photograph felt real. It had a face, and that face belonged to a woman with summer sky eyes, connected somehow to the coldest man in the city. The security office was a small, windowless room that smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. Alara sat on a hard plastic chair, her legs too short to reach the floor. The two guards stood by the door, silent and imposing. They had taken her name, Alara, and the name of her orphanage, St. Jude's Home for Children, but they hadn't asked about the photo. It lay on the metal desk in front of her, looking even more pathetic under the harsh fluorescent lights. A long time passed. Alara's initial surge of adrenaline faded, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the familiar, bitter taste of disappointment. Of course he hadn't believed her. Why would he? She was a nobody, a piece of city grime that had somehow smudged his sparkling evening. She was just about to curl up on the chair and let the exhaustion take her when the door opened. It wasn't one of the guards. It was a man, older than the others, with kind eyes and a face etched with fine lines of concern. He wore a suit just as expensive as Alastair Sterling's, but he wore it with the comfortable ease of an old sweater. "Alara?" he asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, shrinking back in the chair. He smiled, a small, reassuring gesture. "My name is Arthur. I'm Mr. Sterling's head of security. He's asked me to talk with you." Arthur pulled up another chair and sat opposite her, not looming over her like the others had. He looked at the torn photo on the desk, then back at her. "That was a very brave thing you did in there." Alara shrugged, her gaze fixed on her scuffed shoes. "It was stupid." "Why did you do it?" he asked softly. "Because it's true," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That woman, she's my mother. I know it." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading. "The ring. The way her thumb bends back just a little bit too far. It's the same. It has to be." She had spent countless nights tracing the lines of that hand, memorizing every detail, every shadow, every crease in the skin. Arthur picked up her half of the photo, holding it carefully by the edges, as if it were a precious artifact. He studied it for a long moment. "Where did you get this?" "It was with me. When they found me. At the church." "St. Jude's Church, near the orphanage?" "Yes, they left me in a basket, like in a story, with a blanket in this." She pointed at the photo. "It's all I have of her." Arthur's expression was compassionate, but also tinged with a professional skepticism she recognized from the social workers and police officers who had handled her case over the years. The look that said, "Nice story, kid, but we've heard them all." He placed the photo back on the desk. "Mr. Sterling is a very private man, Alara. That photo. It was a mistake that it was shown. It's from his private collection. The woman in that picture was very important to him." "She was my mother," Alara insisted, her voice gaining a bit of its fire back. "I know she was." "Her name was Lena," Arthur said quietly, watching for her reaction. Alara's heart skipped a beat. Lena. It was the first time she'd heard a name. It sounded like music. Lena. She rolled the name around in her mind, testing its weight. It felt right. "Lena," she repeated, a reverent whisper. And the baby?" Arthur hesitated. The kindness in his eyes was suddenly clouded by a deep, profound sadness. "Mr. Sterling believes the baby? That the baby died with Lena in an accident many years ago?" The words hit Alara like a physical blow. Died. The hope that had flared so brightly just an hour ago was extinguished, leaving a cold, dark void. It couldn't be true. She was here. She was alive. "No," she said, shaking her head, the tears she'd been holding back finally spilling over. "No, I'm not dead. I'm right here." Arthur looked pained. He reached across the desk and gently placed a hand on her arm. "I know this is hard to understand, but that's what he was told. That's what he believes." "Then he's wrong," Alara sobbed, the frustration and grief of a lifetime pouring out of her. "Someone lied to him." The door opened again. One of the guards leaned in. "Mrs. Albright from St. Jude's is here to collect her." Arthur sighed and stood up. He looked down at Alara, his face a mixture of pity and something else. A sliver of doubt, perhaps. He picked up the photo from the desk and pressed it back into her hand. "Go with Mrs. Albright now. Get some rest." "But what about Mr. Sterling?" she asked, her voice thick with tears. "Don't you believe me?" "What I believe doesn't matter," Arthur said, his voice grave. "What matters is what I can prove." He gave her a final, sympathetic look before turning and leaving the room. Mrs. Albright, the director of St. Jude's, was a stern woman with a perpetually sour expression. Her lips were pursed in a thin, disapproving line as she signed the necessary paperwork and led Alara out of the gleaming, soulless tower and into the grimy reality of the city night. The ride back to the orphanage was silent and heavy. Alara knew she was in for the worst scolding of her life, followed by a week of scrubbing floors and peeling potatoes, but she didn't care. Her mind was a whirlwind. Lena, her mother's name was Lena, and the man with the winter storm eyes, Alastair Sterling, had loved her. But he thought she was dead. Someone had lied. The thought was a stubborn root, pushing its way through the hard-packed soil of her despair. Back in the familiar drafty dormitory of St. Jude's, surrounded by the quiet breathing of 30 other sleeping orphans, Alara lay awake on her lumpy mattress. She held the torn photo to her chest, the image of the smiling woman with summer sky eyes burned into her memory. She wasn't just a ghost anymore. She had a name, and Alara had a mission. She wasn't dead, and she would prove it. Meanwhile, high above the city, in a penthouse that was more museum than home, Alastair Sterling stood before a floor-to-ceiling window, staring down at the river of lights below. The party was over. The guests were gone. But the silence in the vast, empty apartment was louder than the earlier symphony of clinking glasses and forced laughter. In his hand, he held the other half of the photograph. It showed a young woman's face, radiant with a joy so pure it was almost painful to look at. Lena. Her hair was the color of honey, and her eyes, the exact shade of the sky on a perfect June day, were crinkling at the corners as she smiled down at something just out of frame. Her hand, the one with the ivy ring, reached towards it, towards the baby, whose tiny fist was the only thing visible in the other half. His daughter. The daughter he had mourned for 10 years. Arthur entered the room so quietly that Alastair didn't notice him until he spoke. "She's been returned to the orphanage, sir." Alastair didn't turn. "What did you find out?" "Her name is Alara. No last name. She was found on the steps of St. Jude's Church 10 years ago. Approximate age, a few days old. The only identifying item with her was this. Arthur's voice trailed off, and Alistair knew without looking that he was referring to the girl's half of the photograph. She claims the woman in the photo is her mother. She's a child with a wild imagination, Alistair said, his voice flat, trying to convince himself as much as Arthur. A street orphan looking for a meal ticket. It's a coincidence. It has to be. The ring, sir, Arthur pressed gently. The unique bend of the thumb she mentioned. She was very specific. She'd studied it. And the timing. 10 years ago. It matches. Alistair finally turned from the window. His face was a mask of tightly controlled anguish. He held up his half of the photo. Lena died, Arthur. The baby died with her. A car accident. The police report was conclusive. Reports can be forged. People can be paid to lie, Arthur said, taking a step closer. Your father, he never approved of Lena. He was a powerful man. Alistair flinched as if struck. The memory of his father, a cold, ruthless patriarch who had controlled every aspect of his life, was a wound that had never properly healed. He had blamed Alistair for shaming the family by falling in love with a poor art student. He had threatened to disinherit him, to ruin Lena. The fight had been brutal. It was the night the photo was torn. He had stormed out, keeping the half with her face, a reminder of what he was fighting for. She had left town the next day, promising to call when she was safe, promising they would be a family. A week later, his father had delivered the news of the accident with a chilling lack of emotion. Alistair had crumbled. His father had died 5 years ago, leaving him the vast sterling empire, an inheritance that had always felt like blood money. What are you suggesting? Alistair asked, his voice dangerously low. I'm suggesting that it's a coincidence worth investigating, Arthur replied calmly. Let me go to the orphanage. Let me talk to the girl again. Let me run a DNA test. Alistair stared at the photo, at Lena's joyful face. For 10 years, he had lived in a gray, colorless world, burying his grief under mountains of work and billions of dollars. He had built an impenetrable fortress around his heart. But tonight, a 10-year-old girl with dirt on her face and fire in her eyes had found a crack. A single, terrifying ray of hope was threatening to break through. Hope was a dangerous thing. It was the thing that could destroy him all over again. No, he said, the words sharp and final. Leave it alone. I don't want to hear another word about it. Arthur looked at his boss, the man he had served for 20 years, and saw not a powerful billionaire, but a man terrified of being hurt. He nodded slowly. As you wish, sir. Arthur turned to leave. Arthur, Alistair called out, his back to him once more. Yes, sir? Have a discreet donation sent to St. Jude's. A large one, for their inconvenience. Of course, sir. Arthur left, closing the door softly behind him. Alistair stood alone in the silence, the two halves of his life, the joyful past and the empty present, staring at him from the city lights below, and the photograph in his hand. He wanted to believe the girl was a liar. He needed to believe it. Because if she wasn't, then the last 10 years of his life had been built on a lie, and the grief he had so carefully nurtured was a monument to a ghost that was never dead. The days that followed were the longest of Ilara's life. She served her punishment, scrubbing the endless hallway floors until her knees were raw, and peeling a mountain of potatoes that made her fingers ache. but the physical labor was nothing compared to the turmoil in her mind. The other children at the orphanage treated her differently now. She was the girl who had crashed the billionaire's party. Some looked at her with awe, others with jealousy. Her best friend, a small, quiet boy named Sam, was the only one who seemed to understand. He would sit with her in silence while she worked, sneaking her a piece of bread when Mrs. Albright wasn't looking. "Do you think he'll come?" Sam asked one afternoon as they sat on the rickety fire escape, their secret hiding place. "He has to," Alara said, her voice more certain than she felt. She held her photo, which she now kept pinned to the inside of her dress. "He knows now. Someone has to tell him the truth." But as days turned into a week, her certainty began to crumble. The world outside St. Jude's seemed to have forgotten her. Life went on. The only change at the orphanage was a sudden, miraculous influx of money. A new furnace was being installed, the leaky roof was being repaired, and for the first time ever, there was fresh fruit at breakfast. Mrs. Albright announced that an anonymous benefactor had made a generous donation. Alara knew who it was. It was hush money, a payment to make the problem go away. The realization was a cold stone in her stomach. He wasn't coming. He had chosen to believe the lie. Desperation began to set in. She couldn't give up. She had to get to him again, away from the guards and the crowds. She started planning. She knew Sterling Tower was downtown, a steel and glass giant that scraped the sky. She had snuck onto a catering truck to get in for the gala, a trick she couldn't pull off twice. She would have to be smarter this time. One chilly afternoon, after her chores were done, she slipped out of the orphanage during the younger children's nap time. She used the small amount of money she had saved from running errands for the cook, a few crumpled bills, and a handful of coins to take the bus downtown. The city was a roaring, overwhelming beast, but Alara was a city child, born of its concrete and noise. She navigated the crowded sidewalks with a practiced ease, her small size allowing her to weave through the forest of legs. And then she saw it. Sterling Tower loomed over her, so tall it seemed to poke a hole in the clouds. She spent the rest of the afternoon watching the entrance, a revolving door that spit out an endless stream of men and women in expensive suits. She studied the security guards, the flow of traffic, looking for a weakness, an opportunity. There was none. The place was a fortress. As dusk fell and the city lights began to twinkle, a sense of hopelessness washed over her. She was just one small girl against all of this power, all of this money. What could she possibly do? Defeated, she was about to head back to the bus stop when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened and Alistair Sterling stepped out. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped, the icy composure she'd seen on stage replaced by a profound weariness. He was alone, except for his driver. This was her chance, her only chance. Before she could lose her nerve, she darted across the sidewalk, squeezing past a group of laughing tourists. "Mr. Sterling!" He stopped, his hand on the revolving door, and turned. His eyes widened slightly in recognition. "You," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What are you doing here?" "I had to talk to you," she said out of breath. "Please, just for a minute." He looked around, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. The last thing he wanted was a scene on the front steps of his building. This isn't the time or the place. "You think I'm lying, but I'm not," she pleaded, her voice rising. "My mother's name was Lena. You loved her, but she didn't die. I'm her baby. I'm your. The word caught in her throat. She couldn't say it. It was too big, too impossible. Alistair's jaw tightened. You need to go home, little girl. You're making a mistake. The mistake wasn't mine, she cried, her voice echoing slightly in the canyon of buildings. It was yours. You believed them. You let them lie to you. The raw, unfiltered truth of her words seemed to stun him into silence. He stared at her, and for the first time she saw past the billionaire, past the ice, and saw the man Arthur had described. A man terrified of being hurt, a man drowning in grief. Just then the revolving door spun, and Arthur stepped out. He took in the scene at a glance, his boss rigid and pale, and the small orphan girl defiant and desperate. Sir, is everything all right? Alistair didn't answer. He couldn't take his eyes off Alara. He saw the same determined set of her jaw that Lena had, the same fire in her eyes. Could it be possible? After all this time? Get in the car, he said abruptly, his voice hoarse. Alara stared at him, confused. What? Get in the car, he repeated, clipping off each word. He turned and strode towards the waiting vehicle without looking to see if she was following. Arthur gave Alara a gentle nudge. Go on, he whispered. This is your chance. Numbly, Alara walked to the car. The driver held the door open for her, and she slid onto the impossibly soft leather seat. The inside of the car smelled of leather and something clean and expensive. Alistair got in the other side, and the heavy door closed with a solid, satisfying thud, shutting out the noise of the city. They sat in silence as the car pulled away from the curb and merged into the river of traffic. Alara chanced to look at him. He was staring out the window, his reflection a ghostly image superimposed over the flashing city lights. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Alara knew she should say something, plead her case, but her courage had deserted her. She had gambled everything on this one moment, and now she didn't know what to do. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet. You have her eyes. Alara's head snapped up. What? Lena's eyes, he clarified, still not looking at her. I thought it was a trick of the light at the gala, but it's not. They're exactly the same, the color of the sky just before the sun sets. He finally turned to look at her, and his gaze was so intense it felt like a physical weight. I need to know for sure. The car ride ended at a clinic, a private, discreet establishment in a quiet, tree-lined street. It was nothing like the loud, crowded city clinics Alara was used to. Inside, a doctor with a kind face took a swab from the inside of her cheek. It was quick and painless. He did the same to Alistair. The results will be ready in the morning, the doctor said. The ride back to the tower was just as silent, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer thick with anger and disbelief, but thin and fragile, stretched taut with a terrifying, unspoken hope. They didn't go back to the office. The elevator took them straight to the penthouse. Alara's jaw dropped as she stepped out into the living space. It was bigger than the entire ground floor of St. Jude's. One wall was entirely glass, offering a breathtaking panorama of the city. The furniture was sparse and modern, all sharp angles and muted colors. It was beautiful, but it felt cold, unlived in. Are you hungry? Alistair asked awkwardly. Alara realized she hadn't eaten since lunch, and her stomach was a tight, empty knot. She nodded. He led her to a kitchen that looked like it had never been used. He opened the vast, stainless steel refrigerator. It was practically empty, containing only a few bottles of sparkling water, a carton of eggs, and something green in a plastic container. He frowned, a look of genuine confusion on his face, as if he'd never considered the mechanics of preparing a meal before. I'll order something," he said, pulling his phone from his pocket. While he ordered, Alara wandered around the cavernous apartment. There were no photographs on the walls, no knickknacks on the shelves, no signs that a person actually lived here. It was a showroom. The only personal touch was in his office. On his large, clean desk, there was a single, elegant silver frame. In it was his half of the photograph, Lena's smiling face. He had looked at her every day for 10 years. The food arrived quickly. They ate at a large glass dining table, the city lights their only centerpiece. Alistair asked her questions about the orphanage, about her life. He listened intently, his expression unreadable. Alara found herself telling him about Sam, about her secret hiding spot on the fire escape, about Mrs. Albright's terrible cooking. For the first time, she felt like someone was actually listening. After they ate, he showed her to a guest room. It was twice the size of her dormitory room, with a bed so big and soft it looked like a cloud. There was an attached bathroom with a shower that had more knobs than she knew what to do with. "Try to get some sleep," he said from the doorway, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "It's going to be a long day tomorrow." But sleep was impossible. Alara lay in the enormous bed, lost in the silky sheets, and stared at the sliver of city visible between the curtains. She was in Alistair Sterling's home. Tomorrow, a piece of paper from a lab would decide her entire life. It was too much to comprehend. She must have fallen asleep eventually, because she was startled awake by a soft knock on the door. The sun was streaming through the curtains, filling the room with a warm, golden light. Alistair stood in the doorway, already dressed in a crisp suit. He held a tablet in his hand. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling slightly. "The results are in," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He stepped into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the screen of the tablet. He took a deep, shaky breath. "It's a 99% match." The words hung in the air between them. Alara felt a strange sensation, as if she were floating. 99%. It was real. It was all real. He was her. He was her father. Alistair finally lifted his head and looked at her. The ice in his eyes had melted, and what lay beneath was a raw, vulnerable ocean of emotion. A single tear escaped and traced a path down his cheek. He reached out a hesitant hand, as if he were afraid she might disappear. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. His touch was warm. "Alara," he said, his voice thick with 10 years of unshed tears. "My daughter." And then the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart for a decade came crashing down. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Alara buried her face in his expensive suit, breathing in the scent of him, and for the first time in her life, she felt the undeniable, unconditional, and utterly overwhelming feeling of being home. The world shifted on its axis that morning. For Alara, it was a dizzying, exhilarating tilt into a life she had only ever dreamed of. For Alistair, it was a seismic realignment, a painful and beautiful correction of a decade-long error. The first few days were a blur of awkward adjustments and tentative discoveries. Alistair, a man who commanded boardrooms and moved markets with a single word, was utterly lost when it came to being a father. He bought her things, mountains of things, dresses that felt like spun air, shoes that were too beautiful to wear, toys and gadgets that filled her new room until it looked like a fantasy toy shop. Alara was grateful, but also overwhelmed. The gifts felt like an apology, a down payment on all the years he had missed. What she truly craved was not things, but stories. "Tell me about her," she asked one evening, as they sat in the vast, silent living room. She held the now complete photograph, which Alistair had placed in a simple, elegant frame on the mantelpiece. The two halves, one faded and worn, the other crisp and preserved, fit together perfectly. Lena's smile now had a recipient, the tiny, fist-waving baby she adored. Alistair, who had been staring into the fire, looked over at the picture. A sad smile touched his lips. She was. "Light," he said, the word inadequate, but true. She saw beauty in everything, in a cracked pavement, in a wilted flower, in the way the sun hit a dusty window. She would have loved you so much. He told Alara how they met in a small, independent art gallery where Lena was showing her first paintings. He had been dragged there by a colleague and had been ready to leave, bored and dismissive, until he saw her work. Her paintings were vibrant and full of life, just like her. He bought one on the spot. She had refused to sell it to him, accusing him of being a rich man trying to buy a piece of her soul. He had been so taken aback, so intrigued, that he'd spent the next month convincing her he was more than just his bank account. He talked for hours, his voice soft with memory. He told her about Lena's terrible singing, her habit of putting salt instead of sugar in her coffee when she was distracted, her infectious, bubbling laugh. As he spoke, he wasn't Alistair Sterling, the feared corporate titan. He was just a man remembering the love of his life. And Alara listened, soaking up every word, every detail, piecing together the mother she had never known. For the first time, Lena was more than just a face in a photo. She was a person, her person. But this new, fragile world was not without its complications. The news of Alistair Sterling's long-lost daughter exploded across the media. They were hounded by reporters and photographers. Alara couldn't leave the building without being blinded by flashbulbs. Alistair shielded her fiercely, his protective instincts, dormant for so long, roaring to life. He hired tutors to homeschool her, and for the first time, Alara had one-on-one attention, her quick, curious mind finally given the space to flourish. Yet, amidst the luxury and learning, a quiet guilt began to fester in her heart. She thought of Sam and the others back at St. Jude's, while she was sleeping in a cloud-like bed and eating food prepared by a private chef. They were still in their lumpy cots, eating Mrs. Albright's lumpy porridge. She missed them. She missed the easy camaraderie, the shared secrets, the feeling of belonging to a pack of fellow strays. "Can we go visit them?" she asked Alistair one day. He looked hesitant. "I don't think that's a good idea, Alara. The press." "I don't care about the press," she said, her chin set with a familiar stubbornness. "They're my friends, my family." The word family struck a chord with Alistair. He looked at his daughter, who had known nothing but a makeshift family her whole life, and he couldn't deny her. The visit was carefully orchestrated by Arthur. They went after dark, using a back entrance to avoid the media circus. The moment Alara stepped back into the drafty, familiar-smelling hallway of St. Jude's, she was mobbed. The children cheered, swarming around her, full of questions about her new life. Sam hung back, looking shy and a little lost. Alara pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around him. "I missed you," she whispered. "I missed you, too," he mumbled into her shoulder. Alistair stood awkwardly in the doorway, a visitor from another planet. The orphanage, which he had only ever thought of in terms of a line item for a charitable donation, was suddenly real. He saw the peeling paint, the worn-out toys, the hopeful, hungry faces of the children. He saw the threadbare blanket on the cot that had been Alara's, and he felt a profound, gut-wrenching shame. Mrs. Albright was flustered and sycophantic, a stark contrast to her usual sour demeanor. She bustled around Alistair, offering him a cup of weak tea in her best chipped china cup. Alara ignored her, pulling Sam aside. "It's so big," she told him, trying to describe the penthouse. "But it's quiet, too quiet. I miss hearing everyone breathing at night." Her visit was a whirlwind of joy and sadness. She was thrilled to see her friends, but seeing them highlighted the chasm that had opened up between her old life and her new one. As they were leaving, Sam pressed a small, clumsily wrapped package into her hand. "It's for you," he said, "so you don't forget us." Back in the silent, sleek car, Alara unwrapped it. It was a friendship bracelet, woven from scraps of colored thread. It was lopsided and imperfect, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She slipped it onto her wrist, next to a delicate gold watch Alistair had given her. The contrast was stark. That night, Alistair found her standing by the great window, looking down at the city. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. "He thinks I'm going to forget him," she said, her voice small. "All of them. They think I'm one of them now." "You are one of us," Alistair said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You are a Sterling, but that doesn't mean you have to forget where you came from." He paused, his gaze distant. "Lena never did. It was one of the things I loved most about her." The visit to the orphanage had changed something in him. The abstract concept of underprivileged youth had been given a face, dozens of faces. The next day, he called his lawyers and his financial advisors. He established the Lena Foundation, an organization dedicated to improving the lives of orphaned and abandoned children throughout the city. Its first project, a complete renovation and expansion of St. Jude's Home for Children. But as one part of his life was being rebuilt, another was threatening to crumble. A storm was brewing on the horizon, a storm named Eleanor Sterling, Alistair's mother. He had called her the day after the DNA results came in. The conversation had been short and cold. She had listened to his revelation in stony silence, and then said, "I will be there on Friday. We need to discuss this complication." Friday arrived like a death sentence. Eleanor Sterling swept into the penthouse, not like a grandmother coming to meet her long-lost grandchild, but like a queen inspecting a disgraced outpost of her empire. She was a tall, unnervingly elegant woman, her silver hair styled in a perfect chignon, her eyes the same color as Alistair's, but where his held a thawing sadness, hers were chips of pure, unadulterated ice. She appraised Alara with a dismissive glance, her gaze lingering for a moment on the hand-woven friendship bracelet on her wrist. "So," Eleanor said, her voice as crisp as a winter morning, "this is her." "This is Alara," Alistair said, his voice tight, his hand resting protectively on Alara's shoulder. "My daughter." "Your alleged daughter," Eleanor corrected coolly. "A DNA test can be bought, Alistair. You of all people should know that." "I was there," I saw it myself. It's real, he said, his voice hardening. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand, adorned with several large, intimidating rings. It doesn't matter if it's real. What matters is the perception. A street urchin with no breeding, no background. She cannot be a Sterling. She is a Sterling, Alistair insisted, his anger rising. She is Lena's daughter, and mine. At the mention of Lena's name, a flicker of pure venom crossed Eleanor's face. That girl, she would have ruined you. I did what was necessary to protect this family, to protect your future. By telling me she was dead. Alistair's voice was dangerously quiet. By letting me grieve for 10 years for a daughter who was alive the entire time? A terrible, chilling suspicion began to dawn in his mind. He remembered Arthur's words. Reports can be forged. People can be paid to lie. He looked at his mother, at her cold, unflinching face, and he finally understood. It was you, he whispered, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. The accident. There was no accident, was there? Alara watched the exchange, her heart pounding. She felt like a small animal trapped between two warring predators. Eleanor Sterling finally dropped her regal pretense. Her face twisted into a sneer of righteous indignation. Of course there was no accident. I gave the girl a choice. A generous sum of money to disappear and never contact you again. Or I would use the full weight of this family's power to crush her and ensure she never saw her child. I was protecting you from your own foolish sentimentality. The confession was brutal, cold, and utterly without remorse. Alistair stared at his mother, the woman who had raised him, and saw a monster. The entire foundation of his life, his grief, his purpose. It had all been a lie, a cruel manipulation orchestrated by her. You let me believe my child was dead, he said, his voice shaking with a rage so profound it was almost silent. I paid for a gravestone. I visited an empty grave for 10 years. A necessary sacrifice, Eleanor said, unmoved. Look at what you've become. Head of a global corporation, respected, powerful. Lena would have been an anchor, and this child. She gestured at Alara with utter contempt. She would have been a millstone around your neck. I saved you. That was the moment Alistair broke free. The years of filial duty, of seeking the approval he would never receive, of living in the shadow of his father's and mother's ruthless ambition. It all shattered. He looked at Alara, her small, frightened face, her wide eyes filled with tears, her hand clutching his. And he knew what his choice was. He knew what Lena would have wanted. Get out, he said, his voice low and final. Eleanor's perfectly plucked eyebrows rose in surprise. What did you say to me? I said, get out, Alistair repeated, his voice rising in strength, resonating with a new-found power that came not from his wealth, but from his love for his daughter. You are no longer welcome in this house. You are no longer a part of my life, or hers. He stepped forward, placing himself fully between his mother and his daughter, a human shield. Alara is my future. She is my family. She is everything. And you are nothing to me. For the first time in her life, Eleanor Sterling looked truly shocked. She had lost control. She stared at her son as if he were a stranger. Then her icy gaze fell upon Alara one last time. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Without another word, she turned on her heel and swept out of the apartment, the silence she left behind more damning than any shout. The moment the door clicked shut, Alistair's rigid posture collapsed. He sank onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. The weight of the deception, the cruelty, the wasted years, it all came crashing down on him. Alara hesitated for a moment. Then she walked over and climbed onto the sofa next to him. She didn't say anything. She just put her small hand on his arm, her friendship bracelet a spot of vibrant color in the muted gray room. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and full of pain. "I'm so sorry, Alara," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I wasn't there. I should have fought harder. I should have known." "You didn't know," she said softly, her voice wise beyond her years. "She lied to you. But you know now. We know now." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. They sat like that for a long time, father and daughter, two halves of a broken family finally made whole, watching the sun set over the city, the past a painful shadow behind them, but the future, at last, full of light. The confrontation with Eleanor was a crucible. It burned away the last vestiges of Alistair's old life, the lingering ties to a family built on power and deceit. In its wake, a new kind of family began to grow, one rooted in honesty, healing, and a quiet, determined love. The penthouse, once a sterile monument to wealth, slowly began to transform into a home. It started with small things. Alara insisted on having breakfast at the huge glass table every morning, a rule Alistair, who was used to grabbing a coffee on his way to the office, surprisingly came to cherish. Splashes of color began to appear amidst the chrome and beige. A bright yellow cushion on the sofa, a row of mismatched mugs in the kitchen, and Alara's own drawings, vibrant and full of life, taped to the stainless steel refrigerator. Alistair found he was smiling more. Real smiles, not the tight, polite ones he used in board meetings. He learned the names of the characters in Alara's favorite books and endured listening to pop music he found objectively terrible, simply because it made her dance around the living room. He taught her how to play chess, and was both frustrated and secretly proud when she started beating him regularly. He was discovering not only how to be a father, but how to be a person again. The Lena Foundation became his passion. He poured the same relentless energy he had once reserved for corporate takeovers into overhauling the city's childcare system. The new St. Jude's was the flagship project. The old, crumbling building was torn down, and in its place rose a bright, modern facility with warm, sunny rooms, a proper library, a state-of-the-art computer lab, and a sprawling green playground on the roof. Alara was an integral part of the design process. "There needs to be a quiet room," she insisted during a meeting with the architects, "for when things get too loud and you just need to be by yourself." She remembered the countless times she had hidden in a cramped linen closet for a moment of peace. And the beds can't be in straight lines like a hospital. They should be in little groups, so you can whisper to your friends after lights out. Alistair listened, taking notes, humbled by her simple, profound understanding of what a child truly needed. Not just shelter and food, but comfort, privacy, and connection. He made sure every one of her suggestions was implemented. The grand opening of the new St. Jude's Center was a major event. This time, the media circus was invited. Alistair stood on a stage, not in front of a corporate logo, but a colorful mural painted by the children. Alara stood beside him, holding his hand. He didn't talk about quarterly earnings or market projections. He talked about second chances. He talked about Lena and her belief that every child deserved a home filled with light and laughter. And he talked about his daughter, Alara, who had saved him from a life of emptiness. Alara didn't speak, but when Alistair was finished, she let go of his hand and went to find Sam in the crowd of excited children. She led him up to the stage. "This is my best friend, Sam," she announced to the crowd of reporters and dignitaries. "The new library is going to have a whole section on astronomy just for him." In that moment, she bridged the two halves of her life, proving to herself and to the world that she could be Alara Sterling, the billionaire's daughter, and Alara from St. Jude's, the friend of a quiet boy who loved stars all at the same time. Life found a new, happy rhythm. Arthur remained a constant, benevolent presence, transitioning seamlessly from head of security to a sort of surrogate grandfather, teaching Alara how to drive a golf cart around Alistair's country estate and sneaking her forbidden amounts of ice cream. Alistair's business empire continued to thrive, but he was no longer its slave. He delegated more, took weekends off, and made it home for dinner every single night. One crisp autumn evening, a year after their lives had collided, Alistair and Alara were walking through a park near their home. The leaves were turning fiery shades of red and gold, and the air was filled with the scent of wood smoke. "I've been thinking about something," Alistair said, breaking a comfortable silence. "We never got a proper answer about why she did it." He was talking about Lena. Eleanor had said she gave her a choice, but why would Lena, the fighter he knew, have taken the money and run? Why wouldn't she have found a way to contact him? The question had lingered in the back of his mind, an untidy loose end. "Maybe she was scared," Alara suggested, kicking at a pile of leaves. "Your mother is a very scary lady." "She was," Alistair agreed, but Lena wasn't easily intimidated. A few days later, Arthur came to him with a file. "I took the liberty, sir," he said, placing it on Alistair's desk. "I was never satisfied with Mrs. Sterling's version of events. I had a private investigator look into the financials of the woman who ran the orphanage back then, the director before Mrs. Albright." The file contained old bank statements. They showed a single, massive deposit into the former director's account, dated 3 days after Alara was born. The money was traced back to an offshore account controlled by Eleanor Sterling. But there was another set of documents, letters, which the investigator had tracked down from the director's estranged son. They were from Lena. The story they told was heartbreaking. Lena had been forced out of her apartment by one of Eleanor's fixers. Alone, pregnant, and with no resources, she had been terrified. She took the money Eleanor offered, not for herself, but to secure a future for her baby. She used a portion of it to bribe the orphanage director, ensuring her baby would be taken in and cared for. The rest of it she placed in a trust, to be given to her daughter on her 18th birthday. She had left town, just as Eleanor had said, but her letters to the director were filled with desperate pleas for news of her child and promises that she would be back as soon as she was on her feet and could offer her a safe home. The last letter was dated 6 months after Alara was born. It was sent from a small town in Oregon. After that, the trail went cold. "She didn't abandon you," Alistair told Alara that night, his voice thick with emotion as he explained what Arthur had found. "She was trying to protect you. She was planning to come back for you." He had the investigator continue the search. A few weeks later, they found her. Lena wasn't buried in an empty grave in the city, but in a small, quiet churchyard in Oregon, under a simple stone that read, Lena Jensen, beloved artist. She had died of pneumonia less than a year after giving birth, alone and impoverished, having never spent a cent of the trust fund she had set up for her daughter. They flew to Oregon. The town was small and quiet, nestled between tall pine forests. The churchyard was peaceful. They stood before the grave, two solitary figures against the gray sky. Alistair placed a bouquet of sunflowers, Lena's favorite, on the grass. She wasn't dead, Alara said softly, her hand in his. Not really. A part of her was with me the whole time. She touched the worn half of the photograph, which she now carried in a locket around her neck. And a part was with you. Alistair squeezed her hand, his heart aching with the sorrow of what could have been, but also swelling with gratitude for what was. He had lost Lena twice, once to a lie and once to fate. But she had left him the greatest gift imaginable. She had left him Alara. They stood in silence for a long time, not in mourning, but in remembrance. They were a family, forged in secrets and sorrow, but now bound by a love that was stronger than any lie. The broken pieces of their lives had finally come together, creating something new, something beautiful, something whole. That evening, back in their hotel room, Alara sat sketching in a notebook, a talent she had undoubtedly inherited from her mother. Alistair was reading by the lamplight, but he found his eyes kept drifting to his daughter. He thought about the torn photograph, the object that had started it all. For 10 years, he had clung to his half, a portrait of a smile without context, a memory of joy with no recipient. And for 10 years, Alara had guarded hers, a picture of a connection without a face, a promise of love with no name attached. They had each held a piece of the story, incomplete and lonely. Now the picture was complete. It was framed on their mantelpiece at home, a testament to their journey. But Alistair realized the true picture wasn't the one in the frame. It was the one right here, in this quiet room. It was him and his daughter together. It was the legacy of a woman with summer sky eyes, a legacy not of tragedy, but of a fierce, unyielding love that had transcended lies, distance, and even death to bring them together. He put his book down. "I love you, Alara," he said, the words feeling as natural and necessary as breathing. She looked up from her sketchbook, her eyes, so like her mother's, shining in the soft light. "I know," she said, a small, confident smile playing on her lips. "I love you too, Dad."